My name is Thomas, and I recently moved to an old beach house located on a secluded stretch of coastline. The idea of living near the sea had always attracted me, and when I found this house, I knew it was the right place for me. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore, the salty air, and the constant breeze made me feel a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The house itself was simple, with a rustic architecture, but it had all the charm I was looking for in a retreat. In the first few days, I noticed that the house was near a decommissioned lighthouse. The locals spoke little about it, only mentioning that it had been abandoned for years and that no one cared about it anymore. There was something intriguing about that lighthouse, something that seemed to draw my attention every time I looked in its direction. However, in those early days, I focused on settling into the new house, exploring the beach, and getting used to the slow pace of life by the sea. The lighthouse, with its tall and imposing structure, was just a short walk from my house, and despite its worn appearance, there was something majestic about it. Even so, the idea of exploring it right away didn't seem urgent. I preferred to set that curiosity aside for a while, focusing on enjoying the peace and solitude the house and beach offered. The sound of the sea was a constant companion, and the lighthouse, though always present, was just a detail on the horizon. As I got used to the new routine, I began to notice small details about the place. The house had a subtle smell of sea air, mixed with the aged wood of the walls. The lighthouse, seen from a distance, appeared to be in good condition despite the abandonment, and the silence around was almost absolute, interrupted only by the sound of the wind and the sea. The tranquility was welcome, but there was a slight sense of unease that I couldn't entirely shake off. As the days passed, my curiosity about the lighthouse grew, even though I tried to ignore it. Something about that place seemed different, as if it held secrets that no one dared to uncover. I knew that eventually I would end up exploring the lighthouse, but for now, I was content just observing it from a distance, letting the mystery remain unsolved. But a part of me was already starting to wonder what exactly awaited me inside. A few days after moving in, my curiosity finally got the better of me. I decided to explore the lighthouse up close, convinced that there was nothing special about it, just an old building with a forgotten history. It was a sunny morning, and the walk along the beach to the lighthouse was refreshing. The air was fresh, and the waves gently lapped at the sand as I approached the imposing structure. However, as I got closer, the feeling of unease grew in my chest. The lighthouse seemed even more imposing up close, with its tall tower and weathered walls. Time had left its mark, and parts of the structure showed signs of decay. As I walked around the lighthouse, I noticed something unexpected: graffiti on the outer walls. The messages were clear and disturbing, as if someone was trying to ward off intruders. "Stay away" was written in large, irregular letters, and other phrases like "danger" and "do not enter" were also scattered across the walls. These warnings made me uncomfortable, but at the same time, they heightened my curiosity. Who had left these messages? And why did they feel the need to warn others to stay away? Despite the growing discomfort, I continued my exploration around the lighthouse, looking for more signs of what might be happening there. The wind blew stronger in that area, and the sound of the sea seemed more distant, as if I were entering another world. As I walked around the lighthouse, I realized that the structure was completely isolated. There were no signs of life, no recent trails indicating that anyone had been there recently. The lighthouse seemed abandoned, forgotten by time, but the graffiti on the walls suggested otherwise. The feeling of being watched made me look around several times, but I saw no one. The place seemed deserted, yet the unease in my chest continued to grow. I decided it would be best to head back home for now. The lighthouse, with all its warnings, had raised more questions than answers, and I wasn't ready to explore further at that moment. As I walked back along the beach, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, as if the lighthouse held dark secrets that no one should uncover. I knew that sooner or later I would return, but for now, I chose to leave the mystery untouched. That night, after dinner, I sat on the house's porch, watching the dark sea and listening to the constant sound of the waves breaking on the shore. The tranquility of the place, which during the day was so comforting, at night felt different, more laden with mystery. The lighthouse I had explored earlier stood out against the night sky, its imposing silhouette visible even from a distance. I sat there, staring at it, trying to understand why that structure left me so uneasy. Then something unexpected happened. A light flickered at the top of the lighthouse. At first I thought I was imagining things, that maybe it was just a reflection of the moonlight or a star. But the light flickered again, intermittently, as if it were trying to communicate something. My heart raced, and the tranquility I had felt during the day completely vanished. I knew the lighthouse had been decommissioned for years, and there shouldn't be anyone there. The light continued to flicker, irregular but steady. I stood frozen on the porch, watching, trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening. Who could be up there, and why? The idea that someone was in the lighthouse in the dark of night made me uneasy. The lighthouse seemed to have a life of its own, something I hadn't sensed during the day. Curiosity and fear mingled within me, creating a sense of urgency I couldn't ignore. I got up and went inside the house, trying to push away the idea of going to the lighthouse at that hour. But the flickering light kept drawing my attention, as if it were challenging me to find out what was happening. It was hard to ignore the urge to investigate, but at the same time the fear of the unknown held me back. The night was dark, and the idea of walking to the lighthouse alone made me hesitate. Yet the curiosity was stronger. I decided I needed to investigate. Perhaps it was just someone playing a prank, or maybe there was a simple explanation for the flickering light. I grabbed my flashlight and prepared to leave. The lighthouse, with its mysterious light, awaited me, and I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I discovered what was going on. With a mix of fear and determination, I left the house, walking along the beach toward the lighthouse, not knowing what awaited me there. The walk to the lighthouse that night was unlike any other I had ever taken. The darkness seemed thicker, and the sound of the waves, which usually calmed me, now felt distant and strange. The lighthouse light continued to flicker intermittently, guiding my steps but also filling me with a sense of unease. Each time the light went out, the darkness around me seemed to close in, as if the lighthouse itself were drawing me toward something unknown. When I finally reached the lighthouse, I noticed that the door, which I had assumed was locked, was ajar. My heart raced when I saw deep scratch marks on the wood, as if someone or something had forced their way in. The sight of these marks made me even more uneasy. Something was wrong here, something I couldn't understand. For a moment, I thought about turning back, but curiosity and the need for answers pushed me forward. With the flashlight in hand, I slowly pushed the door open, revealing the interior of the lighthouse. The darkness inside was almost total, and the smell of mold and salt was strong. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing metal stairs spiraling up to the top. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the empty space, creating an atmosphere of tension. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into a mystery I wasn't prepared to face. As I climbed, the flickering light at the top of the lighthouse grew closer. My heart was racing, and the air felt heavier. With each step, I wondered what I would find up there. The sound of the wind against the lighthouse's outer walls mixed with the echo of my own footsteps, creating a sense of total isolation. I was completely alone, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. Finally, I reached the top, where the flickering light was coming from. The space was small and claustrophobic, with dirty, fogged-up windows that let in little light. But what caught my attention most was the makeshift camp I found. There were clear signs that someone had been living there: a makeshift bed with sleeping bags, empty food cans, and a worn-out notebook left on a box. Whatever I had expected to find, I wasn't prepared for this. The question echoing in my mind was, who was living here, and why? As I looked around, my mind tried to process what I was seeing. The makeshift camp seemed to have been there for some time, but it still showed signs of recent use. The empty food cans and the remnants of a campfire told me that someone had been living there, isolated and hidden, at the top of that abandoned lighthouse. But who? And why would they choose such a desolate, forgotten place? My head spun with these questions, and fear began to mix with curiosity. I decided to investigate further. The first thing that caught my eye was the notebook left on the box. The pages were crumpled and stained, as if they had been handled repeatedly by dirty hands. I opened the notebook carefully, hoping to find answers, but what I found were disjointed notes, scribbled in frantic handwriting. Words and phrases that made no sense, obsessively repeated, filled the pages, as if the person writing them had been on the verge of madness. The words, "They are watching," appeared several times, as did, "Don't trust the light." Each phrase seemed loaded with panic, as if the author was battling something invisible and threatening. I flipped through more pages, but the content remained confusing and disturbing. Whoever had written those words was clearly in a state of extreme fear, and the idea that this person might still be nearby made me even more uneasy. As I read the notebook, I heard a sound coming from below. It sounded like creaking, as if someone was climbing the stairs toward me. Panic gripped me, and I snapped the notebook shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned off the flashlight and hid behind a stack of boxes, trying to control my breathing. The sound of footsteps slowly approached, and each second seemed to drag on as I waited, trapped between the desire to find out who was coming and the fear of being discovered. But after a moment that felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. Silence returned to the lighthouse, but the tension in the air didn't lessen. I waited a few more minutes, not daring to move, until I was sure I was alone. I decided it was time to leave. The camp, the disturbing notes, and the mysterious sounds told me that this place wasn't safe. I descended the stairs as quickly as I could, the notebook still in my hands, and returned home, my heart still racing with what I had found. I arrived home feeling a mix of relief and dread. The lighthouse, with all its dark secrets, had awakened something inside me that I couldn't ignore. As I locked all the doors and windows, my mind was still caught on the disjointed notes in the notebook. The words, "Don't trust the light," echoed in my head, and I wondered what they meant. Who were they that were watching? And why would someone hide in the lighthouse, living in complete isolation? As I tried to process everything I had discovered, the lighthouse light flickered again. I turned to the window and saw the beam cutting through the night's darkness, in an irregular and unsettling manner. It was as if the lighthouse were alive, trying to send a message I couldn't decipher. The feeling of being watched returned with full force, and I felt small and vulnerable in my own home. Something was very wrong, and I couldn't shake the sense that the worst was yet to come. I tried to distract myself, but the flickering light from the lighthouse kept me in a state of constant alert. Every time the light came on, my heart jumped, and I couldn't help but look at the window expecting to see something or someone. The night seemed endless, and the notebook I had brought with me now lay on the table, like a dark presence I didn't know how to face. Every word written in it seemed to come to life in my mind, creating scenarios I didn't want to imagine. The fear that someone might be out there, watching me, led me to check all the doors and windows again. But no matter how much I tried to feel safe, the sense of danger was constant. It was as if the lighthouse was trying to warn me of something, but I couldn't understand it. And at the same time, the idea that someone could be living there, in the shadows, terrified me. I knew I needed to leave, but something was stopping me from making that decision. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I collapsed on the sofa, trying to rest. But sleep wouldn't come, and the lighthouse light continued to flicker, like a warning beacon. My mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts and fears, and the only thing I could do was wait for morning, hoping that daylight would bring some clarity about what I should do next. When the sun finally began to rise, I felt a momentary relief, as if the daylight could dispel the fear that had taken hold of me during the night. I got up from the sofa, exhausted but determined to make sense of what had happened. I opened the curtains and looked toward the lighthouse in the distance, expecting to see only the old, silent structure I knew. But what I saw made my heart stop for a moment. There was someone standing at the base of the lighthouse, looking directly at my house. The figure was tall and shrouded in shadows, making identification difficult. I stood there for a moment, unable to look away, while the figure remained still, watching me from afar. The sense of being watched intensified, and the fear I had felt during the night returned with full force. Who was that person? And why were they looking at me? The thought that it might be the same person living in the lighthouse terrified me. I continued to watch, waiting for the figure to move, to do something, but they remained still, as if they were waiting for a reaction from me. Time seemed to drag on, and every second that passed increased my dread. Finally, the figure began to move slowly, disappearing into the mist that was beginning to form around the lighthouse. I stood there, staring into the void, trying to understand what had just happened. Seeing that figure made me realize that I could no longer ignore what was happening. The lighthouse, the flickering light, the makeshift camp, everything was connected in some way, and I needed to find out what was behind it all. But at the same time, the fear that something worse was coming made me hesitate. I didn't know what to do, and the feeling that I was being watched and manipulated by forces beyond my control left me paralyzed. I decided that I couldn't stay there much longer. The presence of that figure, the lighthouse, and everything I had discovered indicated that something was very wrong. I needed to leave that house, to get away from the lighthouse and everything it represented. But before I could make a decision, something even more disturbing happened. Something that confirmed my worst fears and made me realize that it might already be too late to escape. With my heart racing, I began to pack my things, determined to leave the house and the lighthouse behind. As I gathered my belongings, the sense of urgency grew, as if I knew I was racing against time. But as I started to sort through my things, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Someone had already been there before me. Drawers were open, objects had been moved, and some personal items were out of place. The idea that someone had entered my house while I was sleeping filled me with dread. Whoever it was had gone through my things, perhaps looking for something, perhaps just to terrorize me. The sense of invasion was unbearable, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The lighthouse, the flickering light, the notebook, the figure in the mist. Everything was connected in a way I couldn't fully understand, but that told me I needed to leave immediately. As I tossed my things into the suitcase, the lighthouse light flickered again, and this time, I felt it was a final warning, a last attempt to alert me to the danger I was in. But at the same time, the idea that someone might be waiting for me out there, hiding in the shadows, terrified me. I was caught between the fear of staying and the fear of leaving, not knowing which choice was the safer one. Finally determined to leave as quickly as possible, I grabbed my suitcase and headed to the front door. But when I opened it, I found something that made me hesitate. A small scratch mark on the wood, similar to the ones I had seen on the lighthouse door. It was a clear sign that the danger was closer than I had imagined, and the realization that I might have been watched for much longer than I thought left me in a panic. With trembling hands, I closed the door and retreated into the house, realizing that there was no easy escape anymore. The lighthouse and whatever was lurking in the shadows had surrounded me, and I didn't know if I could get out of there safely. The story of the decommissioned lighthouse had become a living nightmare, and I was trapped in its center, unsure if there would be an end to this terror that seemed to have no end. My name is Alice, and I had been needing a break for a long time. The stress of city life was consuming me, so I decided to rent a beach house for a few days. The house was perfect, cozy and situated on a quiet beach where I could relax and forget the world. The trip there was smooth, and when I arrived, I was greeted by a gentle breeze and the soothing sound of waves crashing on the sand. Everything seemed to align for the period of peace and tranquility I had been longing for. As soon as I entered the house, I immediately felt welcomed by the atmosphere. The decor was simple but charming, with light wood furniture and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. I spent some time organizing my things and getting ready for the days ahead. There was no one around, which reinforced the feeling of isolation and rest. This was exactly what I needed, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts. That night, after a light dinner, I sat on the porch to enjoy the evening. The sky was clear, full of stars, and the sound of the waves continued to calm me. As I gazed at the horizon, my eyes fixed on the house next door. I noticed that there were lights on, and in the upstairs window a silhouette that seemed to be watching me. I felt a bit unsettled but decided there was no reason to worry. It was probably just a curious neighbor. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched and went inside to sleep. However, as I lay down, I couldn't get the image of that figure in the window out of my head. Who could it be? And why were they watching me so intently? I shook my head, pushing those thoughts away. I was there to relax, not to worry about strangers. I decided not to let it bother me, and eventually, I managed to fall asleep, despite the uncomfortable feeling that lingered. The next day, I woke up determined to completely ignore the incident from the night before. I went to the kitchen, made a strong cup of coffee, and sat on the porch again, ready to enjoy the morning sun. The idea that I might have just imagined the figure in the window reassured me, and I was determined to focus on relaxing and enjoying my time at the beach. However, that sense of discomfort was far from disappearing completely. After a peaceful breakfast, I decided to take a walk along the beach to enjoy the sun and the breeze. The morning was perfect, and as I walked on the sand, I felt the stress of the city slowly fade away. The beach was practically deserted, giving me a pleasant feeling of peace and isolation. However, the memory of the figure in the window still lingered in my mind, even though I tried to ignore it. During the walk, I couldn't help but notice that the house next to mine seemed even quieter during the day. The curtains were closed and there was no sign of life. As I passed by the neighboring house, I saw the figure of the man in the window and decided to wave. Perhaps it was just a friendly gesture, an attempt to break the ice. However, the reaction, or lack thereof, was disturbing. The man remained there, standing at the window, not responding to my wave. He just continued to watch me, motionless. That behavior made me uncomfortable, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a reclusive person, someone who didn't like social interactions. Still, the way he simply stared at me, without any expression, gave me chills. I continued my walk, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort, but the thought that there was something strange about that neighbor wouldn't leave my mind. When I returned to the house, the unease was still present. The day was beautiful, but the neighbor's behavior ruined part of my mood. To try to distract myself, I decided to spend the afternoon reading a book on the porch. With each page, I tried to lose myself in the story, but my eyes inevitably drifted to the house next door, waiting to see some sign of movement. But everything remained quiet. It was as if the house was in a state of suspension, with that man as the only presence. Despite the discomfort, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. After all, I was there to rest, not to worry about strange neighbors. However, something inside me couldn't completely ignore what I had seen. The feeling of being watched remained, and it began to affect my mood, making me question whether this trip to the beach was really the best decision. When night fell again, I felt a slight tension in the air, different from the previous night. I tried to focus on other things, preparing dinner and distracting myself with television, but that sense of discomfort persisted. As the darkness deepened, my thoughts kept returning to the house next door. I knew the neighbor was there, watching, and that made me even more anxious. The hours passed slowly, and the idea of going out on the porch or even looking out the window filled me with an unease I couldn't explain. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed that the light in the house next door was on again. I went to the window and looked carefully, expecting to see the figure in the window, but this time it wasn't there. Instead, a strange silence took over the night, and I began to hear noises coming from outside. At first they were just faint sounds, almost imperceptible, but as the night wore on, the sounds became clearer. It seemed like someone was walking around my house, carefully stepping on the sand. The sound of the footsteps was subtle but undeniable. I tried to rationalize, thinking it could be the wind or some animal, but the regularity of the steps suggested it was something, or someone, moving around the house. My heart began to beat faster, and the sense of imminent danger took hold of me. I got up and closed all the windows and curtains, trying to protect myself from whatever was out there. The idea of being alone in an unfamiliar house, with a strange neighbor nearby, left me completely panicked. I went back to the bedroom and sat on the bed, trying to stay calm. I picked up the phone, thinking of calling someone, but I wondered what I would say. I'm hearing footsteps outside, but I don't know if it's really someone. It didn't make sense, but the fear I felt was real and palpable. I decided to wait, hoping the sounds would stop and I could convince myself it was all in my imagination. However, when I looked outside again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The neighbor was standing in the yard, in plain view, looking directly at me. He was motionless, just watching me with a fixed and disturbing stare. Seeing him there in the dark filled me with terror. I didn't know what to do or how to react. I slowly backed away, trying not to make any noise, and decided the only thing I could do was lock myself in the bedroom and wait for him to leave. I locked the bedroom door and sat on the bed, trying to control my breathing. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it in my ears. The image of the neighbor standing in the yard, looking directly at me, wouldn't leave my mind. What did he want? Why was he watching me like that? The questions swirled in my mind, but no answer seemed to make sense. I felt vulnerable and exposed, and the fear that he might try to enter the house left me paralyzed. I stayed there, motionless, trying to listen for any sound that might indicate he was approaching. Every little noise seemed amplified, and the silence between them was even more terrifying. I knew he was still out there, waiting. But waiting for what? My mind was in a state of panic, and I couldn't think of anything but getting out of there as quickly as possible. But at the same time, the fear of opening the door and finding him there kept me locked in the bedroom. Time seemed to drag on, and every minute that passed increased my anxiety. I tried to think of a plan, something that would allow me to leave the house safely, but every scenario I imagined ended with him catching me before I could escape. I felt completely helpless, trapped in a cat-and-mouse game from which I didn't know how to escape. My instinct told me to stay quiet and wait, but the fear that he might enter the house at any moment was unbearable. Finally, after what felt like hours, I decided I couldn't go on like this. I had to do something. I got up from the bed and went to the window, trying to look outside without being seen. The sight I found was even more disturbing. The neighbor was no longer there. The yard was empty, and the light in the house next door had been turned off. His absence should have brought me relief, but instead it filled me with dread. Where had he gone, and what was he planning? I returned to the bed, still trembling, not knowing what to do. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The idea that he might be hiding, waiting for the right moment to act, terrified me. I decided that the next morning I would confront the neighbor and find out what was going on. I couldn't go on living with this constant fear. But as I lay down, trying to find some peace, part of me knew that the situation was far from resolved. The next morning arrived shrouded in a sense of unreality. The previous night seemed like a nightmare from which I hadn't fully awakened. But the daylight brought with it a new determination. I couldn't go on living with that fear, and I knew I needed to resolve the situation once and for all. Gathering my courage, I decided I would confront the neighbor and demand an explanation for his strange behavior. Perhaps in the light of day, everything would make more sense. I dressed quickly, and with my heart pounding, I left the house and headed toward the neighboring property. Each step I took on the sand seemed to echo in my mind, a reminder of the tension I was feeling. When I reached the neighbor's door, I realized everything was strangely quiet. There were no signs of movement and the door was closed. I took a deep breath and knocked, expecting to hear some sound from inside, but everything remained silent. After waiting a few minutes with no response, I decided to try the doorknob. To my surprise, the door opened easily. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. I hesitantly entered the house, calling out to someone, but there was no answer. The interior of the house was dark and dusty, as if no one had lived there for a long time. Each step I took raised small clouds of dust, and the sense of abandonment was palpable. As I explored the rooms, it became increasingly clear that the house was uninhabited. The furniture was covered in dust, and there was a terrible smell in the air. There were no signs that anyone had been there recently, and the idea that I might have imagined everything began to creep into my mind. However, something inside me told me that I wasn't crazy, that the man I had seen the night before was real, and that something strange was going on. I decided to keep exploring the house, even as the fear grew inside me. In one of the rooms, I found a pile of old newspapers, and next to it, a box of photos. The photos showed a family that had presumably lived there years before. In some of the images, a man was present, always in the shadows, with his face partially hidden. When I recognized the man as the same one I had seen in the window, A shiver ran down my spine. Something was very wrong there, and I knew I needed to leave before it was too late. Recognizing the man in the photos as the same one I had seen in the window was like a punch to the gut. I held the photos with trembling hands, trying to understand what it all meant. The sense of danger that had enveloped me that night returned with full force, and the idea that I might be in some kind of sinister trap began to form in my mind. Who was this man? And why was he in the house next door if it seemed to have been abandoned for so long? I continued to search through the house, each discovery increasing my anxiety. The photos showed an ordinary family, but in all of them the figure of the man seemed out of place, as if he didn't belong there. In some images, he was only partially visible, like a shadow in the background. In others, his face was turned away from the camera, always avoiding being seen clearly. It was as if he was trying to hide something, a sinister intent that I couldn't understand. I turned my attention to the other objects in the room. The box of photos was full of old memories, but nothing that explained the neighbor's strange behavior or the abandoned state of the house. My fear began to turn into despair. I couldn't find a rational explanation for what was happening, and the idea that I was dealing with something far beyond my understanding terrified me. It was as if the house was permeated by a presence that shouldn't have been there, a presence I couldn't see but could feel every moment. I decided it was time to leave. The fear was becoming unbearable, and the feeling that something was watching me, even in that seemingly empty house, was overwhelming. I hurried out of the house, feeling the weight of an invisible gaze on my back. As I stepped onto the sand again, the sun shining in the sky seemed like a cruel contrast to the terror I felt inside. I ran back to my house, determined to pack my things and leave as quickly as possible. When I finally entered my house, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The panic still gripped me, but I knew I needed to be quick. I began packing my things with trembling hands, my only goal to flee that place before something worse happened. The day was bright, but the fear I felt was real and palpable, and I knew I needed to leave as soon as possible. Every movement I made to pack my things was driven by the urgency to escape. The panic was turning into action, and I knew I couldn't waste any more time. I grabbed my suitcase and began throwing my clothes and belongings into it, not bothering to fold or organize anything. The only thought in my mind was to leave before nightfall, before that man, or whatever he was, returned. The sound of the waves outside, which once calmed me, now seemed like a distant reminder of the danger I was in. As I packed my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The idea that he might be hiding somewhere, waiting for me, terrified me. Every shadow in the house, every noise I heard made me pause for a moment, expecting something or someone to appear. But there was nothing, just silence and my own ragged breathing. I knew I was in a race against time and couldn't let fear paralyze me. I looked out the window several times, expecting to see the shadowy figure in the yard again, but everything seemed calm. The sun shone brightly, but that wasn't enough to dispel the terror I felt. Every second that passed made me question whether I would be able to leave safely. I felt that at any moment something could happen, that the man might appear out of nowhere and stop me from escaping. It was a suffocating feeling, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Finally, with everything packed, I closed my suitcase and placed it near the door. My heart was racing, and my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. I looked around one last time, trying to make sure I wasn't forgetting anything, but the fear that something might be waiting for me outside wouldn't let me think clearly. I grabbed my keys and took a deep breath, preparing to leave. I knew that once I stepped out that door, I wouldn't look back. With one last look at the house, I opened the door and quickly stepped outside, pulling my suitcase behind me. The heat of the sun hit my face, but I couldn't feel any comfort. Every step I took toward the car felt heavier, as if I was moving away from something terrible I had left behind. But the fear that something or someone was following me still consumed me, and I knew I wouldn't be safe until I was far from there. When I reached the car, I threw the suitcase into the back seat and got in quickly, locking the doors. The relief of being out of the house was momentary, but my heart was still racing. I was about to turn the key in the ignition when something made me stop. Instinctively, I looked at the house one last time, as if I was saying goodbye to that strange place. It was at that moment that I let out a desperate scream, feeling the terror take hold of me. There, in the upstairs window of the house I had rented, was the figure of the man. He was inside my house, watching me with the same fixed and disturbing stare that had haunted me since the first night. The realization that he had been there the whole time while I was packing my things filled me with an indescribable terror. With trembling hands, I finally turned the key in the ignition, the car engine roaring to life. The only thing I could think of was fleeing as fast as possible, leaving behind the nightmare that the house had become. As I drove away from that house, doubts began to pile up in my mind, weighing like a dark cloud I couldn't shake. Who was that man really? How had he managed to get into the house without me noticing? And what did he want from me? Every detail of those terrifying hours seemed like an unsolvable puzzle. I wondered if he had been watching me from the moment I arrived, or if there was something darker, a presence that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The lingering fear and the lack of answers made me question whether I would ever find peace, or if the mystery of that house would continue to haunt me forever. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. After months of nonstop work and constant stress, I finally made the decision to get away from it all and rent an isolated beach house. The idea of spending a few days completely alone, with no one around, seemed exactly what I needed to recharge my energy. The house, simple and cozy, was located on a remote beach where tranquility reigned and the sound of the waves crashing on the sand was the only background music. Upon arriving, I felt an immediate sense of relief. The house was small but perfectly suited for my stay. The smell of salt in the air, the gentle breeze flowing through the open windows, everything contributed to creating the peaceful environment I so desired. I spent the first few days adjusting to the routine of doing almost nothing, just relaxing, reading books I hadn't had a chance to open in a long time, and walking along the deserted beach. Solitude, which had once frightened me, now felt like an old friend. However, as the days passed, I began to feel a slight discomfort. It wasn't anything I could point to directly, just a feeling that something wasn't right. Perhaps it was the isolation, perhaps it was just accumulated fatigue, but I began to notice small details that made me uneasy. The way the wind seemed to howl louder at night, as if it were trying to whisper secrets I didn't want to hear, or how the shadows inside the house seemed to stretch unusually as night fell. I tried to ignore these feelings, convincing myself that they were just the product of my tired mind. After all, I was there to rest, to let go of all worries and just enjoy the moment. However, a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone. Maybe it was just the absence of other people that caused my mind to create ghosts where there were none. But still, the discomfort persisted. Despite these sensations, I decided to stick to my plan of relaxation. The house was a perfect refuge, and I didn't want these small fears to ruin my experience. I needed this time for myself, to recover, and I was determined to enjoy every moment. Yet the feeling that something was slightly out of place followed me, like a shadow I couldn't avoid, but tried not to confront directly. A few days after my arrival, the weather began to change. The sky, once blue and clear, started to fill with heavy dark clouds, slowly approaching from the horizon. The wind, which until then had been gentle and refreshing, began to blow stronger, bringing with it the promise of a storm. I felt a twinge of apprehension as I realized that soon I would be completely isolated in the midst of a violent storm. Nevertheless, I decided to prepare and try to stay calm. I spent the day closing the windows and making sure everything was in order. The house was old but seemed solid, and I hoped it could withstand what was coming. I gathered some candles and a flashlight in case the power went out, and I prepared a quick meal before the storm fully hit. As I busied myself with these tasks, I couldn't help but feel a growing anxiety. The thought of facing a storm alone, in such an isolated place, was more intimidating than I wanted to admit. As the storm approached, the environment around the house began to change. The sky darkened quickly, and the first rumbles of thunder echoed in the distance, like a warning of what was to come. The beach, once so peaceful, now seemed a hostile place, with the waves crashing forcefully against the sand. The approaching darkness seemed to swallow everything around it, and the wind now howled like a lurking beast, ready to strike. I closed the front door and felt safe inside the house, but the silent fear continued to grow. When the storm finally arrived, it did so with uncontrollable fury. Lightning streaked across the sky, briefly illuminating the landscape before everything plunged back into darkness. The sound of the wind and rain was deafening, and the entire house shook under the force of nature. I sat on the sofa, trying to focus on the book I was reading, but the storm seemed to demand all my attention. The solitude that had once been comforting now felt threatening. Although I was sheltered and relatively safe inside the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I didn't want to face alone. As the storm raged outside, a new and disturbing element added to my growing unease. Amid the lightning that briefly lit up the beach, I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. The lights of a distant house were on. I knew from what I had been told that the house was empty, with no one staying there. Seeing the lights flicker on and off in a strange rhythm made me uneasy. Who could be in that house during such a strong storm? At first I tried to convince myself that there could be a logical explanation. Perhaps a caretaker had come to check on the house, or maybe an electrical problem had caused the lights to flicker that way. But the more I watched, the more I realized that the pattern of the lights didn't seem accidental. They flickered irregularly, but there was something deliberate about the way they turned on and off. It was as if someone was there, trying to send a signal. With my heart racing, I tried to see more clearly, but the heavy rain and darkness made any clear view difficult. The only thing I knew for sure was that those lights shouldn't be on. The discomfort I had felt since arriving at the house turned into a palpable fear. The feeling that something was wrong was now impossible to ignore. Why were those lights on? And who could be in that empty house? Even so, I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things. Maybe the isolation and the storm were affecting my mind, making me see dangers where there were none. But the truth is, no matter how much I tried to reassure myself, the fear continued to grow. I decided that the best thing to do was to ignore the lights and focus on keeping myself safe inside my house. I was too far from any help, and the idea of investigating the neighboring house during such a violent storm was unthinkable. The storm continued to rage, and the lights in the distant house continued to flicker. Every time lightning lit up the sky, I looked in that direction, hoping the lights had disappeared. But they remained there, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. The feeling that I was being watched, that there was something or someone in that house, haunted me. But I didn't have the courage to investigate. All I could do was wait for the storm to pass and hope that the lights, along with the fear they brought, would disappear with it. Shortly after noticing the lights in the empty house, the power in my house also went out. I was plunged into complete darkness, hearing only the sound of the storm outside and the wind howling around the house. The sudden silence inside, contrasting with the noise outside, was deafening. I grabbed the flashlight I had left by my side and turned it on, trying to orient myself in the darkness. But the weak light from the flashlight was barely enough to dispel the feeling that something was approaching. As I adjusted to the darkness and the sound of the storm, I heard something that made me freeze. Soft knocks at the front door, almost imperceptible, as if someone were asking to come in. My heart raced, and fear took hold of me. Who would be knocking on my door in the middle of such a violent storm? And why would someone be out there instead of seeking shelter inside a house? The idea of opening the door and finding the unknown person knocking terrified me. I tried to ignore the knocks, hoping that whoever it was would give up and go away. But the knocks began to intensify, becoming more insistent. In addition, I started hearing a scratching sound at the window, as if someone were trying to get in another way. Panic took over, and I didn't know what to do. Staying still seemed like the only option, but the idea of being trapped there with someone trying to get in was unbearable. Finally, I decided I needed to act. I grabbed the flashlight with trembling hands and went to the door, fear growing with each step. I was convinced that I had no other choice. I had to face whatever was out there. With the flashlight in one hand and the other ready to open the door, I prepared for the worst. When I finally turned the doorknob and opened the door, My heart almost stopped. There was no one there, just the storm, which seemed even more violent now that the door was open. However, when I pointed the flashlight at the ground, I saw fresh footprints in the sand, leading to the beach. Someone had been there, someone who had now disappeared into the darkness. The momentary relief of finding no one was quickly replaced by an even greater fear. Who was that person, and why were they lurking around my house? And most importantly, where were they now? Seeing the footprints in the sand sent a chill down my spine. The marks were clear and distinct, as if someone had just been there, at my door, in the middle of the storm. The intense rain was starting to wash them away, but they were still visible enough to tell me that I wasn't alone that night. The idea that someone had been so close and now disappeared into the darkness left me utterly terrified. I slammed the door shut, locking it quickly and backed away, trying to calm my racing heart. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and my mind was spinning with unanswered questions. Who was that person? What did they want? And why did they approach my house during the storm? The disappearing footprints in the sand told me that, whoever it was, they were still out there, and the fear that they might return at any moment paralyzed me. As I tried to figure out what to do, the storm continued to rage outside, and the sound of the waves mixed with the howling wind. I felt trapped inside that house, unsure if I was truly safe. The darkness around me seemed to close in more and more, and the idea that someone was out there, watching, waiting, terrified me. Even with all the doors locked, the sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. I decided that I needed to make sure all the windows were closed and locked. I went through each room, double-checking every lock, trying to convince myself that I was doing everything I could to protect myself. But as I walked through the house, the feeling of being watched grew. It was as if I could feel someone's eyes on me, even without seeing them. The flashlight, my only source of light, seemed too weak to ward off the fear that surrounded me. Finally, after checking all the windows and doors, I returned to the living room where I sat on the sofa, trying to think of what to do next. The panic was almost unbearable, and the only thing I wanted was for the storm to end and for morning to come, bringing some relief. But something inside me told me that the night still held more terrors. The storm continued with relentless intensity, and I felt like a prisoner inside that house, with nowhere to escape. Every sound, every creak of the wood seemed amplified, feeding my fear. I tried to stay calm, focusing on my breathing, but the anxiety was at an unbearable level. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm myself, but as I did, I heard something that made me freeze in fear. Wet footsteps inside the house. The sound was distinct and impossible to ignore. Slow, rhythmic footsteps, as if someone were walking barefoot on the wooden floor, leaving a trail of water wherever they went. My heart raced, and I felt panic take over me. How could someone have gotten in if all the doors and windows were locked? The idea that there was someone inside the house with me in the middle of the storm was terrifying. The flashlight in my hand trembled, and I knew I needed to act quickly, but fear paralyzed me. With my heart pounding, I began to search the house, following the sound of the footsteps. Every move I made was accompanied by a growing sense of dread. The flashlight illuminated only small sections ahead of me, leaving the rest of the house shrouded in threatening shadows. I felt as if I were being hunted, each step bringing me closer to the unknown intruder who was inside the house with me. The sound of the footsteps seemed to come from all sides, as if the intruder were moving silently and deliberately, avoiding being found. I didn't know what to do. The idea of confronting them terrified me, but the alternative of hiding and waiting for them to find me was even worse. I tried to stay calm, but with each passing second, the panic grew more intense. I was alone, without help, and didn't know how to escape the situation. Finally, as I approached the hallway, I saw a drenched figure standing in the dim light. It was a man, with wet clothes and disheveled hair, holding something sharp in his hand. He looked at me with a disturbing smile and whispered, as if it were a game, "Let's play hide and seek. You have 30 seconds to hide." His tone was childlike, but there was something deeply sinister in his eyes. The terror I felt in that moment was indescribable, and I knew I needed to flee as quickly as possible. The sight of the man in the hallway, with that sinister smile, froze me in fear. His macabre proposal of hide and seek sounded like a children's game, but the look in his eyes made it clear that this was far from a joke. Every passing second felt like a prelude to something much worse. My whole body trembled, and panic took over me, causing my mind to race as I desperately tried to find a way to escape. He began counting slowly, in an almost casual tone, as if he were enjoying the terror he was causing. 1, 2, 3. The sound of his voice seemed to echo through the walls, amplifying the horror of the situation. I knew I didn't have much time. With the flashlight trembling in my hand, I looked around, searching for an escape route. The only possible exit was the window at the end of the hallway. I needed to reach it before he finished counting. Without thinking twice, I turned and ran down the hallway, the sound of the numbers being counted behind me, getting closer. 4, 5. The fear that he might catch up to me before I reached the window pushed me to run faster than I had ever run before. My breathing was heavy, and my heart felt like it was about to explode in my chest. 6, 7. With each number, the tension increased, and the distance between us seemed to shrink. Finally, I reached the window. With trembling hands, I tried to open it, but it was stuck, resisting my frantic efforts. 8, 9. The sound of the counting was almost upon me, and desperation took hold. I knew I didn't have any more time, that I needed to open that window or it would be too late. I pulled with all my strength, feeling the tears of panic streaming down my face. The wood gave way a little, but not enough. He was coming, and I was almost out of options. Then, at the last second, the window finally opened. Without looking back, I threw myself out, landing in the mud and water that had accumulated outside. The cold of the rain and mud was a shock to my senses, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I knew I couldn't stop. With the sound of the storm around me and his voice echoing in my mind, I began to run, without looking back, determined to escape that nightmare at any cost. The rain was pouring down hard, mixing with my tears as I ran across the wet sand. Every step was difficult, with the wind howling around me and the storm lashing at me mercilessly. But the fear that he was right behind me, ready to catch me, drove me to keep going, despite the exhaustion and despair. I knew that if I stopped, he would find me, and the terror of imagining what might happen made me run even faster. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and that house. The darkness was almost total, except for the occasional lightning that lit up the sky, briefly showing me the extent of the path I still had to travel. The sound of the storm drowned out all other noises, but in my mind I could still hear his voice counting, calling out to me. The feeling of being chased was overwhelming. Finally, I spotted the lights of a house in the distance, a small beacon of hope amid the chaos. My energy was running out and each step felt more difficult than the last, but fear kept me moving. I knew that if I could reach that house, I would have a chance to ask for help, to finally escape the nightmare. With each lightning flash, I looked back, expecting to see his dark figure following me, but the storm was relentless, hiding any threat in the darkness. When I finally reached the house, I pounded on the door with all my strength, screaming for help, my voice almost lost in the sound of the wind and rain. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline, and all I wanted was a safe place to hide, to escape the madness that was pursuing me. The door finally opened, and I was greeted by a concerned look, but I couldn't say anything. I just collapsed, exhausted and terrified, into the arms of the person who had opened the door. As I slowly recovered from the shock, doubts began to pile up in my mind. Who was that man? Why was he in my house? How had he gotten in? And most importantly, what did he intend to do? These questions echoed incessantly, but I knew the answers could be even more terrifying than everything I had experienced. The only thing I knew for sure was that I would never return to that house during a storm. The terror I felt that night would haunt me forever,